Could you give us a sense of how you negotiate the relationship between not just performer and composer, but also a third element like an artwork or something like that that comes into the process?
Yeah, well, in some ways I'm a little bit of a strange fish in this. I've always been a practicing artist as long as I've been a performing musician. It was a difficult decision probably when I was 11 or 12 which way I was going to go, and I probably resented having been made to have to go either direction. So that means that I've always used both processes not to inform the other, but as kind of tangled up with each other. I'll often, a little bit like what you've talked about, to simplify it from my point of view, might solve a problem at the instrument on paper. But that won't necessarily mean that the solution to the problem will come out as music. It might could come out as a drawing. Actually, it might come out as nothing at all. I think one of the things which can become a little bit of a confusion these days with a lot of talk about things like synesthesia, which I was hoping to avoid talking about today, is the assumption that all artistic process has to result in something. And I think we're both believers in creative silence, not in order to produce something, but sometimes because that's what comes out. You know, it can just be an idea. But what is exciting about working with paintings or with artists is how much it empowers the process back at the instrument. An example would be the great Icelandic composer Hafliði Hallgrímsson, who is also a great artist. I remember once in a recording session, he said to me very early on, this will be 30 years ago, he said, "I would like you to use the bow like a paintbrush and don't stop using it until the very last bit of pigment has left the brush." That was fantastic. But he's also very playful. Once we asked him how we should play a phrase in a violoncello duo, and he said, "like a seagull." So the whole relationship of the visual to what we do is fundamental. Think how many times as a composer you'll do a musical gesture where the look of the gesture will be in your mind. Obvious example would be the conductor in Brahms 1. Ba-da-da, ba-da-da, be that is the music. So I think that's a very complicated answer to a simple question.
Given that you occupy both worlds, how close do you think it is? Is it important that there is a close relationship between the two? The reason I ask that is I think there's sometimes quite a lot of wishful thinking about where the different disciplines cross over, and I also think it's different for everyone, and I don't know how much it really matters.
I think a word which I learnt how to use in a different way from artists was the word practice. So an artist, when they talk about their practice, they're talking about the totality of what they do. They're talking it as almost a holdable, graspable object in itself, whereas musicians have a tendency to talk about something rather different. And that idea of practice, a little bit like the idea of observance, is for me how it works. I can think of musicians I really respect, and the pianist Stephen Kovacevic, who I've been friends with for many years, and the first thing he'll do when he comes up to you is say, "So where are you at the moment?" And he means, give me a score, 1 to 10. Are you at 6, 7, 8? Where is your practice? Now that and I think what's exciting about the interrelationship between the arts is the honesty which it demands. I think we all have a tendency to try and hide, and you and I are both probably, one thing we agree on is we're really fascinated with very high-level technical processes. We like the long way round. And I think that's one of the things which is amazing about, say, if you take an artist, think of Michelangelo's drawings. He's taking the absolute longest way around to get to something. He sometimes just doesn't even get there.
I don't know if this sounds incredibly crude, but what would be the difference in playing with a painting or in the presence of a painting and playing in the presence of a huge installation like the Tyrrells? Is there a different relationship?
Oh, hugely, and the difference is to do with religion. So I will answer it with a story. A few years ago, I was in the middle of one of my many projects with the Cypriot composer Aitchison, who I'm very close to. And we decided to go and work in the Archaeological Museum in Nicosia, in Cyprus. And they had a huge Apollo Kytherides classical sculpture there. So it's Apollo holding his lyre, his kythera. And for reasons passing understanding, I decided to play the chaconne to Apollo. Don't do that. Within 3 minutes, I was more scared than I've ever been in my life. Do you remember that moment in Mary Renaud, The Mask of Apollo, when the mask is on the table and the hero recognizes that this mask is pulsing? This sculpture started to absolutely start to threaten me. And I think the interesting thing is that what Turrell is activating is close to elements of ritual. It's close to the divine, and it puts us into both a very comfortable space but a very dangerous space. There are some paintings that do that, but some paintings are what our friend Simon Shaw Miller would call provisional. You need to activate them by being with them. Other paintings, such as the Botticelli crucifixion in the Courtauld, for instance, is so overwhelming that all you can do is just wait with it. But there's a distance. There's painting which invites you to work with it to make something happen. Art which completely envelops you. And I think Turrell, whether he was aiming to do this or not, has walked into that area of this kind of all-enveloping, which is an amazing thing. And he's done it through technique.
So we both went into the Sheppard Skaerved tank with the camera obscura inside it, and both experienced that extraordinary crushing darkness. And my feeling is that everyone has a slightly different experience of it. Some people are absolutely terrified, some people find the womb-like darkness comforting. How do you feel about negotiating with different people's reactions to stimuli like artworks, or do you only think of your own reaction, or are you thinking of a kind of general reaction across response from several people, or how do you feel about that?
My answer is a very oversimplistic one, which is the more sophistication and complexity goes into a work of art, the less the artist gets to control the reaction and experience of it. It's one of the things you learn from working a lot with curators, that a museum, one of the exciting things about a museum is everyone's experience is completely different, and that is the way it should be. And we can't tell people how to feel. We can't. Interestingly, it's not much use if we tell them how we feel either. Something else. I'm not somebody who believes that artists should be having that many feelings when they're doing things. In fact, that whole thing with Apollo was, I'd ceased to become an artist, I'd become a victim or a kind of supplicant. That was not an artistic act going on there. That was blind panic. So I think it's this fantastic contradiction. The more precise, the more detailed we are, the more we labour to get things as precise as we can, the more we accept we have absolutely no control either of the result or the experience. We on the one side, Enescu used to quote Nietzsche, "We must dance in chains." And those chains are our inability in some ways to be completely free, and that lack of freedom is what gives the freedom to the person experiencing the art to be free. My point, artists aren't supposed to have fun. So, not helpful perhaps, but I don't know.
So, Approaching the Tyrrells, given the way they sit in the landscape here, and given the way that they are kind of made of landscape or negative parts of landscape, and then situating that within the wider landscape art tradition around Cornwall, from Hepworth to all the other major figures that have worked here, how do you relate your experience of the Tyrrells to the land and your investigations of the landscape?
Well, the funny thing is, although I have a long association with Cornwall, my father was evacuated here, lived here after the war, I spent all my summers here. The one thing I'd never really associated with Cornwall, except my own experience of it, were particular artistic traditions. Even after I'd started working quite a lot with Tates and Ives, whilst was very much a fan of what came out of Cornwall, I was not entirely convinced that much of it had that much to do with the landscape here, if I'm really honest. Not in the sense, if let's be really kind of conservative, not in the way that, say, the 19th century and 18th century artists like Sandby or Tom Girton or leading up to Bonington and Turner and Constable had a relationship with the landscape. I mean, if you want somebody who had a real relationship with trees, you need Constable. You know, you see. So I was somewhat dubious. What's interesting is I would say that in some ways what Tyrrell has done is engage with a kind of big-skied British landscape tradition. Perhaps that's links to the big works he's done with the Roden Crater or that kind of thing. But my experience with him, which goes back 30 years now, has always been of this intimacy and grandeur fluctuating. That isn't so alien to the question of Cornwall.
Mm-hmm.
Cornwall doesn't have big vistas. It has big sky, has quite, but actually there's not that much landscape here. You walk that direction and you're going to fall off it. You know, so that's kind of, it's Cornwall is in many ways imagined spaces. Foggers, for instance. I do think it's interesting. I know if I walk 25 minutes from here in that direction, I can go into a prehistoric underground religious space, which is very close to what he's doing. I wonder whether he knew about this. Did you?
Probably.
Yeah.
Possibly.
That's so he's tapped into that for sure, which is that's fundamental. Think of the number of sacred springs, and every time you go under a bridge into in stream in Devon or Cornwall, there's a sense of this kind of primal space. So he's definitely playing with that.
When working with Tyrrell, I'm faced with something that is terrifyingly simple, but incredibly complex. But what I've found is I can't necessarily match that grandeur of simplicity and get the same kind of effect. I'm possibly having to work harder in terms of pedaling a lot more than Tyrrell's had to, because of not because I'm able to work in any way approaching what he does, but simply because it's that dynamic of what he's created. I wonder how you feel about people creating artworks creating music in relation to artworks, and what happens if there's an imbalance? You have a simple proposition in the artwork, but you perhaps have a complex musical response.
The simple answer is there's always going to be an imbalance. So I don't worry about a non-equivalence or equivalence. It's someone. An example would be, I think that Morden Feldman's 5-hour quartet could be played alongside the Weber and Bagatelles, and that wouldn't seem like an imbalance. So you offer something, you find purchase in the work, and you hand something to me which gives me agency, and it gives a passport. And I'd like to say something about what you just said about pedaling very hard. In my experience, the harder a fine composer like you pedals, the more grace-filled it feels. So the harder you're working, the less work is heard. we're in Icarus territory here. But the fact is, if I think about the beautiful piece, which we played twice in the space today, it feels like you dreamt it. I don't know whether that's what you're hoping, but playing the violin hurts. If it doesn't hurt, you're not doing it right. But or think of a ballet dancer is in constant pain, but you get Swan Lake from that. And I think that's, in many ways, is the answer.